Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into something pretty heavy, a Louisiana Court of Appeals document. In this case, State of Louisiana versus Michael Louding. This case is really fascinating.
Yeah, it really gets into some complicated questions about our justice system, especially because, well, Louding was only 17 at the time of the crime.
Okay, so 17 years old, and the court is trying to decide, can a teenager, can it be so set in their ways, I guess you could say, that a life sentence,
Without parole.
yeah, without parole is the only option?
And it's a question that we as a society are kind of always grappling with, right? How do we deal with young offenders who commit serious crimes?
So for our listeners today, our deep dive is really all about understanding how the court got to that decision, a life sentence for a 17-year-old. And to make it even more complicated, this is all happening after that Miller v. Alabama ruling from the Supreme Court back in 2012. Can you remind our listeners about that?
Oh, absolutely. Miller v. Alabama, that was huge. It basically said you can't just automatically give someone under 18 life in prison without parole, even if they're convicted of murder.
So it's not as simple as, murder equals life sentence when it comes to minors.
Right, exactly. The courts now have to consider, well, they have to consider the kid's age, obviously, but also their background, any mitigating factors, things that might help explain why they did what they did.
So not about excusing it, but understanding the why behind it.
Exactly. It's about getting the full picture. Miller v. Alabama, it's all about recognizing that juveniles have, well, they have a different capacity for change, for rehabilitation, than adults do.
So let's get into the specifics of this case, starting with the crime itself. We're in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, October 21st, 2009. A man named Terry Boyd is murdered, shot, and killed while he was inside a house. Shots fired from outside, through a window.
Yeah, sounds like a scene from a movie, right? But it gets even more intense from there. Michael Louding confesses to the murder. And get this, he says he was hired to do it by the rapper Torrance Lil Boosie Hatch for $25,000.
Whoa, hold on. So we're not talking about some random act of violence here. There's a motive, a whole other story going on.
According to Louding, yeah. He claimed that Boyd had threatened Hatch, so this was a hit, basically, to, well, eliminate that threat.
And that's not all, right? Louding's confession, it didn't end there. He admitted to participating in, well, a whole string of similar shootings, all planned out ambush-style attacks.
It's really disturbing stuff. He confesses to being involved in the murders of Chris Jackson and Marcus Thomas, the shooting of Malika Holbert, and even a double homicide. The victims were Charles Matthews and Daryl Milton.
It's almost like he was on some kind of rampage, which makes his age all the more disturbing. Remember, Louding was only 17 during all of this.
Yeah. And that's what makes this case so complicated. Because you have these horrific crimes, but he's still legally a child. So the big question for the court was, did his age, and any mitigating factors, did those outweigh the seriousness of the crimes? Can someone this young really deserve life without parole?
So the court had to figure out where to draw the line.
Yeah, a really tough decision.
So let's look at Louding's defense team. What were they arguing? How were they trying to get a lighter sentence for him?
Well, they really focused on Louding's childhood. It was rough, to say the least. Lots of poverty, exposure to violence, just a lot of really difficult stuff.
So they were saying that environment, all those challenges, those things kind of push him down this path.
Exactly. They were building a case that all of those external factors played a huge role in shaping his behavior, that he was a product of his environment in many ways. And to support that, they brought in people who knew him.
Like family.
Yeah, family members, people who could talk about what it was really like for him growing up. They also had a public defender who was familiar with his history. All of these testimonies, they were meant to show that, that his childhood was really troubled, full of hardship.
It's not about making excuses, but it kind of helps you understand how someone ends up in this kind of situation, right?
Exactly. And they went a step further. They also had a clinical psychologist testify, Dr. Frederick Sauter.
Okay, so a psychologist, that's interesting. What did he add to the defense's argument?
Well, Dr. Sauter testified that it was very likely that Louding was suffering from PTSD, from all the trauma he'd experienced, And this was really important for the defense because it suggested that his mental state, it might have played a role in his actions.
So it wasn't just about, a difficult childhood, but the psychological effects of that childhood.
Right. And that was another key point in Dr. Sauter's testimony. He believed that with the right treatment, Louding could actually overcome his PTSD, that there was a real possibility for him to change, to rehabilitate.
So you have two very different perspectives here. On one hand, these multiple murders, and then on the other hand, you have this young man who might be struggling with some serious mental health issues because of his past. How does the court even begin to untangle all of this?
Yeah, and they didn't take it lightly either. They actually held two separate sentencing hearings. They really wanted to consider all the evidence, all the testimonies before making their decision.
Wow, two hearings. That's a lot. It sounds like they wanted to make sure they got it right. So what did they end up deciding? What swayed them?
That's the big question, and well, that's what we're going to get into next, because even after all that, all those mitigating factors, the court ultimately decided to reaffirm the life sentence.
Wait a minute. So two hearings, all that testimony,
Yeah.
and they still went with life in prison. It sounds like something must have really tipped the scales.
You're right, there was another piece to this puzzle, and that's what we'll dive into next.
Okay, so the court held not one but two sentencing hearings. Two. They heard from the defense, the psychologist, and the family talking about Louding's difficult childhood.
It's true, and they took all of that into consideration.
And yet they still gave a 17-year-old kid life in prison. What was it about this case that made them decide that was the right call?
Well, the court said that while they did take all those mitigating factors into account, there was something else, something important that they couldn't ignore. Louding had a long juvenile criminal history.
So even though he was young, he already had a serious record.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's right. And that played a big part in their decision. They said they had serious doubts about whether he could really be rehabilitated. I mean, he'd already been involved in so much crime.
So it's like they saw that pattern and thought, okay, this is probably going to continue.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, there were reports that he was even involved in criminal activity while he was already locked up.
Oh, wow. So even while incarcerated, he was still engaging in criminal behavior.
Yeah, and that definitely made the court question his potential for change.
I see. So in their eyes, he was still heading down a dangerous path, no matter what his age was or what kind of childhood he had.
Right, it seemed like nothing was going to stop him. And the judge actually used this really strong phrase to describe him. He said that Louding was, quote, incorrigible.
Incorrigible. Wow. That's like beyond hope.
Yeah, it implies that the court believed there was no chance for him to change. No chance at all.
It almost feels like they thought he was beyond rehabilitation, even with, what the psychologist said about PTSD and all of that.
Right, and that actually brings us to a really important point in this case, and it's something that's been debated a lot. The defense actually wanted to bring in a mitigation specialist. Her name is Juliet Yackel.
Hold on. A mitigation specialist. What's that?
So a mitigation specialist, they're kind of like investigators, but for a defendant's life. They spend months, even years, really digging into their backgrounds.
So getting all those extra details, all the stuff that might help the court understand them better.
Yeah, exactly. They talk to family, friends, teachers, anyone who can shed light on who this person really is, what their life has been like.
Makes sense. And they wanted her to testify about all that.
Exactly.
But wait, you said this was something that's been debated. Did they not let her testify?
That's right. The court wouldn't allow it.
Why not?
Well, they said that her testimony would have been hearsay because it was all based on what she learned from other people, not her own direct observations.
Okay, so it was like a technicality, a rule that prevented her from speaking.
Yeah, in a way. But it's more than just that. Think about it. Trying to understand someone's life without hearing from the person who's spent months piecing together their story.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, she probably had so much information that could have helped the court really get to know Louding.
Exactly. And that's what makes this so controversial. Some people argue that by excluding her testimony, the court might have missed some crucial information that could have changed their view of Louding, his potential to change.
Wow. So this wasn't just about the crime itself. It was about the process, the rules of the legal system.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity to the case, because on one hand, you have the desire to really understand a defendant, get the full picture. And then on the other hand, you have these procedural rules that sometimes get in the way of that.
And in this case, because of those rules, the court didn't get to hear what this expert thought about Louding's ability to change.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about the crime, about Louding's background, the court's reasoning, and now even some of the procedures of the court. But taking a step back, what does all this really mean?
It comes down to this question. Can someone who is so young, someone who has done these terrible things, can they still be considered incapable of change? Is it fair to label a 17-year-old as incorrigible, like the judge said.
That's really tough to answer. I mean, multiple murders.
Mhm.
It's hard to imagine anyone coming back from that.
Right. But the whole idea behind Miller v. Alabama, that ruling, it's all about understanding that juveniles, their brains, they're still
You
developing.
don't always make the best decisions.
More than that, the parts of their brain that are responsible for thinking ahead, for controlling impulses, they're just not fully formed yet. And there's a lot of scientific research to back this up.
Okay, so you're saying that we have to consider those differences when we're sentencing young people who commit crimes.
Yes, absolutely. We don't ignore the crime. It's still serious, but we can't just throw away the possibility that they might be able to change, especially when they're so young.
So it's about looking at the whole picture, not just the crime itself.
Exactly. And I think this case shows how challenging that can be, especially when you're dealing with a crime as serious as murder. There's this constant tension between wanting justice for the victims and recognizing the potential for young people to turn their lives around.
When I think about this case, I keep coming back to that phrase, the worst of the worst. It's such a harsh label to put on anyone, let alone a 17-year-old.
I agree. It's a powerful statement, and it really highlights the moral dilemma at the heart of this case. Where is the line between recognizing someone's past and holding them accountable for their actions?
It's almost like there's a gray area here where it's hard to say what's right and wrong.
Absolutely, and that's what makes this case so interesting to talk about. It forces us to confront these uncomfortable questions, not just about the law, but about ourselves, too.
It makes you think about your own values, your own beliefs about justice and second chances.
Yeah, it's definitely not a simple case, but these deep dives, they're all about exploring those complexities.
And it's not just about Michael Outing, right?
Yeah.
This case raises some bigger questions about how we deal with juvenile crime, mental health, the purpose of our justice system, all of that.
It shows how these issues, these huge systemic issues, how they play out in individual lives. And it challenges us to really think about the things that lead to crime in the first place. Things like poverty, trauma.
Yeah. Thinking about Louding's tough upbringing, all the struggles he went through, it made me wonder, to what extent can we say that a difficult past excuses the choices we make as adults? Because we all have a past, right?
Right.
We've all been shaped by our experiences.
That's a powerful question, and it's one that each of us has to wrestle with on a personal level, because it gets to the heart of personal responsibility and how we choose to respond to the challenges that life throws our way.
Yeah, it feels like we're trying to balance those things all the time. Like,
Right.
how much do our experiences excuse our actions? How much are we responsible for?
It's a question that doesn't really have a simple answer. Every situation is different. Every person's life is different.
Right. And I think that's part of what makes these deep dives so interesting. They're not about finding the right answer all the time.
Mhm.
It's about asking those difficult questions, having these conversations.
Exactly. And maybe even changing our minds along the way, or at least seeing things from a new perspective.
I think this case really shows that. Because on one hand, you have this young man who committed some truly horrific crimes. But on the other hand, you have this really troubled past, this difficult childhood that might have played a role in his actions.
And that's the challenge, right? How do you balance those two things? How do you hold someone accountable for their actions while also recognizing the factors that might have contributed to them?
Yeah, and this case also made me think about our justice system as a whole.
Mm.
It makes you wonder if our focus is more on punishment or rehabilitation.
That's a big question, and it's one that every society has to grapple with because we want to believe that people can change, that second chances are possible, but at the same time, there are victims, and those victims deserve justice too.
And that's what makes these cases so complicated. It's not just about the legal arguments. It's about our values, our beliefs about right and wrong, and how we choose to deal with those who break the law. This whole case, it wasn't just about Michael Louding. It was about all of us as a society and how we deal with really complex issues. Juvenile crime, mental health. It was about figuring out where justice really lies.
Absolutely. And like you said, there aren't always easy answers, but that doesn't mean we stop asking the questions.
Right. I think that's the biggest takeaway from this deep dive. There's always more to learn, always more to think about. And it's okay to not have all the answers. But what's important is that we keep having these conversations. We keep challenging ourselves to look at things from different angles.
I couldn't agree more. These deep dives, they're all about digging deeper, exploring those complexities.
Exactly. And that's what makes them so rewarding, even when the topics are tough. So to all our listeners, thank you for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and we'll see you soon.